Gingerbread, one of the most enigmatic treats in existence. You can't find it everywhere these days, but where you do find it, it's plain as day. So, what exactly is the deal with this sweet treat, and why is it you find it in Appalachian cookbooks and at Christmas time and about nowhere else? It might help to specify exactly how we're defining gingerbread here. The go-to prototype of gingerbread that probably springs to mind, that is, the gingerbread man in this house, is only one specific variety of gingerbread out of a good handful. It is, however, pretty well representative of one of the two major types, those being hard gingerbread, such as the gingerbread man, and soft gingerbreads, which are more towards the cake end of the cookie cake spectrum. For the purposes of this video, we'll be including both varieties in our investigation. So for us, gingerbread will basically be any sweet bread in which ginger is a primary ingredient. Now that we know what we mean by gingerbread, what about where this stuff came from? Well, ginger came from China to Europe over the Silk Road sometime well prior to the 1500s. This was a popular move because it turns out ginger is pretty good at a lot of things besides just tasting good. Amongst other properties, ginger is particularly good at calming upset stomachs, aiding against inflammation, and preserving breads. The end result of that was that gingerbread became widely popular throughout Europe, and by the Renaissance was found at about every fairground and in every royal court. This is about when the gingerbread men, as we know them, start appearing, though not quite in the generic shape we have today. Hard gingerbreads had already been cut into various shapes for quite some time, usually something appropriate for the season or fair it was being sold at, but Queen Elizabeth I of England is the one generally credited with popularizing the humanoid shape, having commanded the kitchen staff to have gingerbread cut and decorated into caricatures of her courtiers. Side note, this isn't actually where the gingerbread man fairy tale comes from. It's part of an old category of story known as the fleeing pancake stories, all of which follow the same basic plot of a baked good fleeing to avoid being eaten and ultimately failing at that. As the name of the genre suggests, most versions of the stories involve things like pancakes or Johnny cakes, though it's difficult to tell exactly which version is oldest, since these fairy tales were an oral tradition long before they were written down. Presumably, the gingerbread man version is the most popular because the gingerbread man has legs to run with while the pancakes don't. On a similar note, gingerbread houses also have a fairy tale touch. Though they existed long before the Brothers Grimm were even born, it was their publishing of the story Hansel and Gretel in their famous book of fairy tales in 1812, in which the gingerbread house of a witch plays a key part, that made the making of gingerbread houses more widely popular. Back on the main topic, gingerbread basically continued as it had been for several centuries in Europe. The exact recipes and decorations varied, but in general, the upper class decorated their gingerbread lavishly, often to the point of using gold leaf. The lower classes tended to stick to simpler shapes and icings. Geographically, the British Isles tended towards soft gingerbreads, while the mainland, especially Germany, preferred the hard varieties. Both kinds would make their way to the colonies with their respective nationalities, and would be carried with them as exploration pushed west, including to the Appalachians, where gingerbread would find a welcome table at church functions and other special events long after the rest of the country moved on to other baked goods. Gingerbread would stay a fairly big deal until about the 20th century, even being noted to have been used as a bribe in elections to try to sway voter opinion in favor of one candidate or another. As the 1900s rolled in, however, something kind of odd happened. Gingerbread, once so popular, started showing up less and less in general, with the exceptions of the fall and winter holidays in the Appalachian region. Nowadays, gingerbread is mainly the hallmark of genre cookbooks of either the candy cane or mountain flavors. Sure, it's not totally gone elsewhere, but why is it that gingerbread has held out so much better in these two areas? For the holiday part, it's relatively simpler to explain. Fairs were historically held for special occasions, and the harvest and winter holidays certainly counted for that. The association with Christmas in particular is a bit tough to explain, but from what Smithsonian Magazine can tell at least, somewhere along the way, possibly because of historical connections between gingerbread and religious ceremonies or guild, gingerbread and gingerbread houses had become associated with Christmas, particularly in Germany. Gingerbread's holdover in the Appalachian region, however, takes a bit more explaining to understand. To begin with, let's look at some actual recipes for gingerbread. The best place to start is probably A Domestic Cookbook by Melinda Russell. It's an important cookbook for a number of reasons. It's the first cookbook written by an African American lady, for one thing, as well as a rare example of a cookbook written by a woman from the Appalachian region. The most relevant part for now, though, is the sheer number of gingerbread recipes this cookbook contains. Out of 33 pages of recipes, about 14 recipes involve ginger in some way, and 10 or so out of those can be considered gingerbread proper. That is a very high percentage of any one specific food being represented in a single cookbook like this, especially one this short. It's a strong indicator of how popular gingerbread was in this time period, especially in Appalachia, since that was where Russell got her start. The sheer number of different recipes is also a good indicator that gingerbread was a fairly accessible dish in the Appalachians in this time period. The second recipe Russell gives for gingerbread in her cookbook is one of the simpler ones she gives. We'll ignore the exact measurements and focus on the ingredients themselves. This recipe calls for molasses, sugar, lard, eggs, baking soda, ginger, flour, and sour milk. But this is just one recipe for soft gingerbread. What do other recipes call for? These recipes from the Gingerbread Book by Stephen Stellingwerff are for two slightly different versions of hard gingerbread. Again, ignore the exact measurements, those vary between recipes. The basic gingerbread uses flour, ginger, molasses, brown sugar, butter, baking soda, and some egg. The old-fashioned gingerbread only uses a slightly different recipe. There's more spices than just ginger, the butter has been substituted for vegetable shortening, but the rest of the ingredients are the same. So what do these recipes tell us? Well, that there are certain ingredients that have to be in gingerbread to make gingerbread. As it happens, Stellingwerff has also noticed this and did short bits about how each ingredient impacts the resulting treat. Using this as a guideline, we can see that Stellingwerff has defined the basic ingredients for gingerbread as being eggs, spices, sugar, molasses, and flour. That doesn't quite cover all the bases, however. While all the different recipes don't call for butter exactly, all the gingerbread recipes call for some variety of fat or shortening. Baking soda also makes an appearance in all the recipes. That leaves the final list as being eggs, spices, sugar, molasses, flour, fat, and baking soda. All of these, then, are ingredients that would need to be accessible by the average Appalachian cook. But some of those things don't sound like they could easily be acquired by many Appalachian people. Wheat doesn't grow well in mountainous soil, and molasses has to be traded for, as does baking soda and ginger. Considering how difficult it could be for many Appalachian families to get more than just the bare necessities, how did they get the stuff to make gingerbread in the first place? They did it the same way that they did with any other hard-to-obtain thing. Make do and substitute. For wheat, the substitute of choice is cornmeal. Corn is far easier to grow in the Appalachians, and cornmeal was already a staple for a variety of recipes anyway. The end texture obviously ends up different and probably won't ever be able to make any hard gingerbreads, but the end result is still perfectly delicious. Molasses is actually one ingredient that Appalachian people probably didn't even realize they were substituting. The molasses found in grocery stores today is a product of producing sugar from sugarcane, which can't grow in the mountains. And yet, as Sydney Saylor Farr notes in her book More Than Moonshine, homemade molasses was far more readily available to her community than refined sugar. Farr's same section on molasses offers something of a solution to this sticky mystery. The syrup that brought communities together to make didn't come from sugarcane, but from sorghum. Sorghum syrup is by this point one of the quintessential foods when Appalachian foodways are talked about, and is actually fairly expensive to get your hands on these days, but can still make a delicious part of any gingerbread. Baking soda would be one of the trickier substitutes. Admittedly, once it was widely available, baking soda would have been relatively affordable. In 1892, one advertisement lists wholesale prices for it as being cents per pound, at least to resellers. Baking soda's creation was a revolution in the world of cooking, allowing far more control over the leavening of breads than ever before. But what was used before baking soda was mass-produced? The precursor to baking soda, a rough substance called pearl ash, refined from potash, which is itself a byproduct of burning plant material, usually wood. Pearl ash was widely used in the colonial era, and it wouldn't be much of a stretch for the stuff to have lingered in areas of the Appalachians that would have had difficulty getting to a store. For ginger, the substitute that Appalachian people historically would have used is actually wild ginger, scientific name Asarum canadense. The flavor of wild ginger is different from the variety usually found in modern grocery stores, but similar enough to have been an acceptable substitute for most gingerbread-based recipes. It should be noted, however, that wild ginger has been determined to contain poisonous compounds, so please do not try this at home. Considered all together, we can see that the ingredients for gingerbread would be relatively easy for the average Appalachian cook to assemble. Compare said ingredients to what's needed for something like most cakes or cookies, which generally aren't plentiful in the middle of the mountains, and we can see just how much easier gingerbread would be to put together, hence the continuing popularity where other treats overtook gingerbread in star status elsewhere in the country.